ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how.
Well, hello there, and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial. We are going to learn some more about FileMaker Pro. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these tutorials from my website, ISO FileMaker Magazine. In this video tutorial, we're taking a look at the topic of default fields. I'm going to be going through my default fields. I've got a few of them that I use that I found out that I ended up putting them in every single table. I ultimately always needed them. I'm going to give you an overview, and maybe you're going to learn something along the way. All right, thanks for joining me here on my desktop. First off, I have a web page loaded. We are going to be visiting this web page. This is where you're going to be able to get the file that I'm ultimately going to show you, where you can use my current file and use the fields that I'm actually going to showcase. But before we head off to the fields that I add, or the default fields that are added into every table, we need to take a look at what you're probably already familiar with if you're not already developing with FileMaker on a regular basis. So one of the default things that I do is I will create a new file. I will typically create a blank file, and then I just create that on the desktop. I save it as untitled. I always reliably expect that I can just create a new untitled file, untitled.fmp12 file whenever I'm creating something new. So if you are just starting out with FileMaker, or you're intermediate, or you've never played with FileMaker, setting FileMaker's default fields, this is what you get with FileMaker. Now, this is a great starting point, but it's not super helpful, and that is because it does not account for modern development, nor any of your specific needs. And I'm going to be explaining my specific needs and why I use the default fields later in this video. Primary key, every table almost always has a primary key. Creation and modification timestamps, and created by and modified by. Now, these are great and they're helpful and all, but they are not modern. One good thing that we notice here is we can always click on the comments, and I highly suggest that you add comments. You're going to see in my default fields that I use, which I've added to the FileMaker standards, I always have comments, but I take advantage of this comment field and I actually use JSON, which is actually a big benefit because it allows you to grab metadata about your solution. I'll show you how and why I use that. Now, the reason that these alone, and these two in particular, are not super helpful is because in most cases you end up wanting to know when something was created relative to a constant or a fixed date in time. The values that are supplied here in these fields are set by default to a timestamp which is local to the computer. So the very first time that you have somebody outside of the time zone that the server is hosted in, or wherever the file is being used, somebody in East Coast versus West Coast, or over in Europe or anywhere else, your dates are all off because this includes the time zone offset of whenever the record was created. So we want something that is consistent. That's number one. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how you switch this out, and I'm going to do that in the Finder right now. Hey there, this is Matt. Thanks for taking the time to watch my free videos on YouTube. This video has been sponsored by what we see on screen right here. Now, if you are looking for hosting, there's a ton of places that you can choose from, but I choose to go with fmcloud.fm, and I'll tell you why. They use the latest technology. Now, I haven't worked with other providers. They may be using the same technology, but I know the owner of fmcloud.fm, Fabrice Nordman. I trust him. I know he knows what he's talking about because his understanding of technology is absolutely solid. Now, these guys are using container-based technology. So every instance of your FileMaker server is completely isolated from another server. How does this benefit you? Well, because of that situation, they're able to provide all of the features, the full features of your FileMaker server. Now, if you go with some of the other providers, you may not have features that you would like to have, such as the ability to run your own plugins. And because each of these containers are isolated from each other, you really have a robust security setup. Now, if we take a look right here, just like any other provider, you can choose from all kinds of different places, anywhere across the globe that you might want to host your FileMaker database system so that your latency is low and all of your clients are connecting really close to your FileMaker server. So if you're looking to set up your own FileMaker server or maybe migrate from another provider, then take a look at the link that I have in the description or on the video or on screen right now at filemakermagazine.com/hosting, and we'll redirect you to fmcloud.fm, where you'll be able to take advantage of their great offers. All right, so I've jumped over to the Finder, and what we are interested in, at least on the Macintosh, this is the location of where we're going to find everything. It is here on the hard drive. Well, that's my hard drive. In the users folder, in the shared folder, we are going to find a folder titled FileMaker. Now, you're going to see a number of folders in there, and in the shared folder for your users, you're going to find a shared folder for FileMaker. So it's FileMaker shared. If I went into it, this would be the full path right here. Hard drive, users shared, FileMaker shared. So there is two shared that we have right there. Now, what you're going to see is either this folder will not exist, which you will need to create it, and none of these files will exist. I actually have multiple of these, and that is because this is a version of the default fields.xml file prior to, I want to say FileMaker 18, but I forget which version when we got a new version. But FileMaker 18, 19, 20 are all going to be using a file not called default fields _mat, but FM default fields. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this, and I am going to take off those right there. So when we create a new table, FileMaker will now use this file it will read this file, and it'll use any of the contents within this file in order to create the default fields. So we'll go over to FileMaker, my untitled database. We'll go into the manage or define. I will now create a new table called untitled2. I'll click create right here. When we look at that, we can see that the difference of 5 fields, this was FileMaker's built-in internal default fields. Now this has my 12 fields, and we're going to be going through all of these and why I add them. In particular, the ones that you may be interested in are found, count, load, rec ID, JSON, and unindexed. These are the fields that I've added beyond what I would consider the core. Now, the core, as we saw before, was a primary key, a modification of the user, and the timestamp, the creation and modification. So those are still here. I name all my primary keys in every single table, ID no matter what. Go take a look at FileMakerStandards.org. Then we have the created on, the modified on. FileMaker had those by default, the created by and the modified by. Now these are our local timestamp. In fact, you can determine what time zone a user was in by looking at the time offset, the distance in the amount of time from these two fields. Now, these two fields are not by default in the FileMaker table, but they absolutely are in mine, because no matter what, modern development, we're working across users across time zones. So you will want these two. Now, I'm not going to explain these too much, other than the created UTC is really pretty easy, because we have a calculated value that simply uses the FileMaker function get UTC milliseconds. In fact, in newer versions of FileMaker, FileMaker 19.5 and higher, or 19.6, we also have get current UTC microseconds right there. While not absolutely necessary, this is such a small amount of time that even if you're creating records, if you have a server-side script and it creates records so quickly, most of the time the milliseconds will serve you just fine. But if you do want microseconds, that is available in those versions and higher. So the created one is really easy. The modification one is a little bit different. In this particular calculated value, what you're going to see is a little bit of a different function in here. There's always something to learn about FileMaker. In this particular case, we are using a trigger. In other words, we have to have something that causes FileMaker to actually update this value, because we have turned off the do not replace existing. Meaning it's not getting it the first time, such as when it's created, but every time that anything happens. Well, because getField actually looks at all of the fields on a particular record, but we have not specified a single field, I believe that mere virtue that we are referencing this function looks at all fields because it is looking at all fields, and we put it into a variable called trigger. That means that if any field is modified, then this value is populated into the modification. So the learning trick here is that if you use, or if you want to force a auto enter calculation to trigger, regardless of which fields you reference in FileMaker, then you can use this right here, this format of trigger and just a blank get field. And that means that every single time that a record is modified, no matter what the field, you will be able to trigger the result of this particular let function. So that's a really cool tip right there if you have not learned it. And of course, we do uncheck this so that every time any of those any field is modified, we get the new date. We always put on prohibit modification on any of the fields that we are using underneath, but for the most part, this is somewhat moot because we don't typically reveal these fields, at least for the ability for the user to modify. Even if you do put them on the layout, by having this checked, this is what prevents a user from accidentally changing a value. Now you can see right here, what we have is, this is my JSON-based version of comments. So when we click to toggle right here, we'll go ahead and take a quick look at those. You can see that I have comments for all of them, the primary key, timestamp, account, etc. What's great about using JSON within your comment, and I forget which video I shot this in, but it's really good to know, is that FileMaker actually has a function that allows you to get the field comments off of a particular field. Along with that, FileMaker has meta functions that allow you to get a list of all fields in a table, which then allows you to simply just cycle across that list and get the comments, or get the comment value, off of every field. Now, if you have formatted it as JSON, a well-structured format, then you get to do all kinds of things. For example, one of the things that I do is I use FileMaker and I deploy an online file to the App Store. So one of the values that I actually include on this is a version tag right there, where within my JSON, I will have a version of a 1.4. So each release of a data file that I make, I will actually identify what version of the data file a particular field was added. This is super helpful. This comment area can really be flexible when you use JSON as your comment. And as you can see, just put the comment as the first one and it reads really well. And then everything else off to the end will just trail off out at the end right here. So I love that particular thing that you can do. These are all tricks that you can do with FileMaker that really weren't expected to be used. JSON came after FileMaker had the comment, but let's use JSON within the comment. So we are going to go through now each of these fields and why I actually add them. I've already explained why you want this. You want a consistent time, which is based on, what is it? It's called UTC, but I always think of it GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, which I think there's some difference. Look it up on Wikipedia. But it's basically a constant time no matter where the record is actually captured. That's what we want. But let's go through each of these now and discuss why I have them added. And we will then take a look at how you can add this, or where you get this file, so that if you want to start with the same 12 fields that I use, I will show you where you can get this, and I've already showed you where you can add that file, and we're going to do that right now. All right, so we're going to start with the first field. I'm going to switch to FileMaker. I'm going to create a new file again. I'm just doing this because I want to show you, of all of the fields, sometimes there is an issue with calculated fields when you add these to that the FM default fields XML file. I don't know why. It's just a little, it's either a little bug or there's something. The specifications for the XML format for FileMaker's default fields, you can't find it. It's not anywhere. You sort of have to adapt and learn from what FileMaker includes, and FileMaker does not include any default fields. Out of all of the possible default fields, FileMaker's own default fields does not include any calculations. Now we're going to be seeing where we can access the specifications for a field, but for some reason, sometimes some things fail. So here we have the found count, which is one of the default calculated fields. And most of that is that a calculated field, when we look at a calculation, one of the things that we have is this evaluate this calculation from the context of. So when it comes to default fields, a brand new FileMaker file with new default fields knows if you have references to relationships in a new file that existed in an older previous file, they won't exist. And so a calculated field, I'm guessing, might have certain hidden settings, but we're going to take a look at that. Regardless, one of the fields that I include is a calculated field, actually two of them right here, but they are referencing just a straight FileMaker function. So the get found count, why do I add this? Inevitably, no matter what, you end up with a solution and you want a convenient look. We'll switch over to a FileMaker file. You can get these files, by the way, over at templates.fm, and they'll probably redirect to the to an iSolutions website. I had worked with iSolutions to create the theme that's used in FileMaker, the Apex Blue theme, and so this actually is a good presentation of it. But what we're looking at is this right here, this count. This inevitably is something that you almost always want as a result of adding things to a portal. Now we click plus, that'll go over here, it'll create a new thing. I'll click the back button right here, which is, you can find this in a video. It's a subscribers only video over on FileMakerMagazine.com, but you can see that the count went up by 1. So let's go ahead and set this up in this file, this new one that I created right here. We'll do this really quickly. Of course, it created a new untitled table with my default 12 fields. All we need is another table. I'll create an untitled 2. We create that. We can see that we've got 12 and 12 with one record in our primary table. We're going to create a relationship. Before we do that, we're going to double click this. We can now add our foreign key, which is going to be simply ID_untitled, or whatever the foreign table is in terms of how I like to do things. Actually, I wanted to create. There we go. So now that I have that, I can go to my relationships. In the relationships, we are simply, a lot of the times, if you don't see, or if you have a long list of fields and you don't see the field, this is a FileMaker tip, a developer tip if you're not used to it. You do not have to click this little thing and scroll or do anything. Simply the best way when you're an advanced FileMaker developer, you simply just drag and you just connect anything, because you can always double click the relationship and then scroll and get to the field that you want and click the change option. So changing that there and then clicking allow creation is going to allow me to create my related records, which here on the layout, we simply click our portal tool. We quickly add a portal. We will switch to the untitled 2. We will turn on deletion, turn on vertical scrolling, go ahead and leave it at always. We're not doing any design work right here. I'm going to throw JSON in there as a field. We'll say OK, and I will drag this out to the side. Now, the most common thing is I want to get a found count of the items. How do I do that? Well, I simply go to the text tool, which is the most common, drag some text out, and I'm going to use a merge field. So if you don't know about it, it's under the insert menu up here up at the top. And we are going to find that right down there towards the bottom, merge field. We are going to merge in the field from the related table. So going to that, we're going to specify this found count. And then whatever it is, shirts, items, whatever it is, rows, whatever you want to put right here. Now, do recognize that there's a couple of ways that you can do this with this particular setup with the default field. I'm using just a text field. So this word rows is always going to show. But fortunately, if there are no related records, this will show a 0 or a found count. But we might hit our issue here. You can see right now, FileMaker's showing 1 row. So this is what I'm talking about when it comes to the default fields. Even though I've looked at all of the specifications, regardless of how many records I add here, this is not updating, and it should update. So there's potentially a little hidden trick in there that is not revealed that we don't know about. Typically, this is solved by going over to the table, double-clicking on the field. Now we can see that there is this setting right here, do not evaluate if all reference fields are empty. Now the storage options, which is right here, that we can see, we know this is set in the XML file for the default fields to not store. If we check and uncheck that, but most importantly, if we uncheck that right there, we click OK, this is what we get as a result of the problem. So knowing that those checkboxes are there is super helpful if things aren't working when it comes to unstored calculated fields and them getting to update. Because now what happens is, as soon as we add all of our new fields, you can see that each record that I add, this is updating that found field. Now, if you don't want to have this added, you don't want to have to double click or check that until we can find out whether the setting is, and we're going to take a look at this towards the end of this video, whether the setting is something that is obscure or it's a version specific thing to FileMaker. Sometimes I've had it work, sometimes it not work. Anyway, long story short, that's the fix. If you have a calculated default field that for some reason does not refresh, you go in, you check and uncheck some checkbox, and then it fixes FileMaker. There's things that they're constantly adding and changing, and who knows whether they fix or break this particular feature. But that is the found count field, and that is the reason that I add it. No matter what, you're almost always having some type of related data, and having this in your database is of no consequence if it's not shown. FileMaker's not having to evaluate it, but if it's there, it's right there, available and immediately ready for you to use. And that is what you get as a result. It's a very common thing, and of course it works when you delete records as well, because we have that delete feature turned on the portal. And it just goes down and it shows you the proper row count. So that's one of the first fields. Now let's move to the next one. All right, let's move on to the next field. The next field in our list of my default fields that I add to everything is a load field. Now you may end up with multiple of these depending on how complex your solution is, but inevitably you will want to use some of FileMaker's most powerful features, which in this particular case, the feature we're talking about is go to related record. Now there's many ways to get a list of primary keys. You can do it with SQL, execute SQL's, the execute SQL FileMaker function, which will allow you to grab anything from any number of table occurrences, even if they're not connected in the relationship graph. You can also get them from a get list of summary field, which that might even be a default field that I might add in the future, is a list of either the ID or what we're going to see coming up, the record ID. But the load, if you have not used it, is one of the most common things that you do in all of FileMaker development. Is you will either create an actual relationship based on the load field, or in most cases, a self relationship. So this is what allows you to load a subset of records. Let's take a look at how this is actually used if you've not developed with FileMaker. So what we're going to do, in my layout here, I'm going to create a portal, and that portal is going to be based on, current table. So I am on the current table. This is a what they call master detail, where this particular portal in FileMaker shows whatever records are in the current found set. So we'll say OK. In this case, we don't have an actual field yet. We'll use the JSON field again. Let's go ahead and put a name field in my regular. Name is actually a standard field that I put in almost every table. Let's change the name field on that so that we have our standard setup right here. And we'll put a copy of the name field outside. And in most cases, what we do, we'll turn off the label. Most cases, what I end up doing is this, almost inevitably, if it's a sidebar for this particular portal, is almost always a single segment. We get rid of those two, and I now have access to a calculated value. In this particular case, we are going to put the name field, which is hidden there behind me, but we'll say OK. And we will, let's make the portal much larger. I usually make this to the same size. Let's go ahead and size that out. I've got the scroll bar, so we'll just size it up here, and let's size it up to the top, and then we'll scroll the portal so that it's just underneath right there. Not the best. We'll go over to the styles right here. I'll go ahead and take the time because maybe you like learning about FileMaker. We're going to set that to transparent right there. So that what happens is each new record we will create. Do I not have access to that field? Let's see here. Field entry into browse mode right there. That name field did not have. We'll create a new record and put Tom. And another record. Sorry about this. Sorry about not having some data in here. So we've got all of our records in here. So inevitably, what you want to do is many times you will provide a picker, you will provide you could use a web viewer, you can use any type of method that the user says, I want to see this, 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 and this. And they're just checking a bunch of checkboxes, and you want to dwindle down a subset of records, or you want to go to a related set of records. And the best way to do that is to use a load relationship. In fact, I call my relationships load based on the load global field. Now, a global field doesn't cost you anything. It is just a field that can be used in a relationship that's stored in memory. So we will add that field to our table here. We're going to go over to our settings here. We're going to turn on the show vertical scroll bar anytime we have multiple keys. The load field is typically never shown. You don't add this to your layout. In fact, a lot of the times what I do as a developer, I'll keep it in the off-screen area. And while I'm developing, doing whatever I need to do, if I need to access it manually, I just temporarily drag it on screen right there, go into browse mode. I have access to it. And then when I'm not developing, then I just drag it right off. That's a very easy way to use the load field. But if you are not familiar with this concept, going into the define relationships, this is a very common scenario where we want to be able to load a certain number of records. So regardless of how you're going to use the load, and the load field can be used for multiple tables in your solution. Not just the same table, but any other table. It's called a utility global. And so let's create a self relationship. And what we're going to do is you get to load based on any field that you want. If you want to load records based on last name, you can do that. Just get a list of the last names and go target the last name field. Most of the time, you're going to target the ID. So again, developer, we don't need to go find that load. I'm just going to drag ID to ID, but I'm going to double click the relationship and I'm going to scroll and specify the load on the left side of the relationship and change that. So what happens now is we now have what FileMaker has as a capability, which is a multi-key field. In other words, we can have multiple keys within this global text field called load, which all of those values will relate to all of the individual records on this side of the relationship. We do not need anything specified here or here. We just simply say OK. And in most cases, what I do is I call the relationship aptly load and then whatever the base table is. So in this case, it would be load on untitled 2. Let's go ahead and make that correct right there. And so actually this is based on untitled, so it is not untitled 2. Always good to be correct. So when I go to set up a script or do anything, this load is going to allow me to load whatever records I want. Now, as you're going to see, there's a more efficient way to do this, and it's one of the reasons that I put in the rec ID, and it's why we're going to be talking about it after the fact. But let's put the primary key to this particular record here on screen. Let's make it a little bit smaller so that we can see that. And we'll go into browse mode. Actually, and we will also do this. Let me left justify this. And also on this calculated value, we are going to merge in and be able to see the ID as well. So we're just going to be able to see that. I need my ampersand sign right there, Matt. Need to concatenate that. So it's really ugly, but at least I can see what's going on. So here's how this works. Whatever values are in the load field, using that relationship will load just that subset of records. So let's say, for example, we want to see Matt. So this is Matt's key right here. We'll grab that and we'll paste that in. Let's go ahead and make this so that we can see everything. We'll make it a much smaller text since I'm zooming in so that we can see all the individual keys. Let me scroll this on screen. We'll switch to Cindy's record. So let's say Matt and Cindy are the only two records we want in our found set. It could be going to a related table occurrence. Doesn't matter. The whole point is whatever key values are in this load field, we can now go to just those related records. So obviously you're going to create a script, but in this case, we can use just a regular button. That button alone, if we type in load, we can use a single step. And this is one of the most powerful steps in all of FileMaker. Let's add the step of go to related record right there. So with any relationship, because of the multi-keys, whatever keys we have in there, we go to the related. And you end up doing this all over the place in FileMaker. It is why it's one of my default fields. In this particular case, we are going to go to the untitled 2, but we are going to stay on the current layout. Now, here's a key thing. If you're to be an advanced FileMaker developer, you have to know that what you can do on the relationship graph is because you can choose a completely different layout, which can be based on a completely different context or create a different context, you can hop from one connected group of table occurrences to another group of interconnected table occurrences if it's the same base table, because this right here allows you to choose a different table occurrence that's based on the same base table. So you're able to hop contexts within FileMaker. That's a key thing. Now you get to choose whether you show a new record or a new window. I'll go ahead and do that now. You also can say, I only want to show those related records. Now in this particular case, I would just be dwindling, so I'll turn the window off. And of course, if you're on mobile, you can set up your animation. So with that one step now, whichever key values are in my load global, when I click load, could not display the result. Is that because I have the current layout? Let's see. Doing this live is always iffy. I want to, let's make sure that my relationship is correct. That's why I do not want to specify untitled 2. That is the wrong relationship. This is the right relationship. This is my current context. I want to load records from here, but stay on a layout from here. Again, it's very easy to get confused within FileMaker. So I want to load the records in the untitled. This is a self relationship right there. And so now this should actually work. When I go into browse mode and I load it, you can see that my found set just dropped from my 4 records to my 2 records. There's Matt and Cindy. If I need to show all, I can click show all or have that in the UI. Just to confirm, and this is what I love, that we can see right here, let's put in Tom's key right there, copy and paste, and Susan's key. And we will hit a return and put that in right there. We click load, and the only 2 records that are going to be shown are Tom and Susan. Now, this is extremely powerful. Here is an advanced developer tip that we're going to learn about this, and that is the fact that when we start to consider what we're doing across the network in FileMaker, that this is a lot more data than maybe this and this. So this is where we get into the very next default field and why I add it to my FileMaker solutions or to all of my fields in all of my tables. All right, so the most coolest thing that we can know, that we can use, that makes data transfer across the network lower, especially when we're passing parameters and we're doing things with perform script on server and even in client, is this field for free we get is one of the very few fields in FileMaker that is a get function, but is actually indexed and can be stored. As you can see right here, the setting on this particular field is that this is indexed. Now, you can have both an indexed and a non-indexed version of this particular field. But by default, the field is indexed. It is built into FileMaker, and what it is it's a serial number that's constantly incrementing that never, ever changes, even if you clone the file. So what we get is the ability to use this instead of our foreign or our complex or our longer key values. What this means is it's less data transfer when we're doing a perform script on server, and overall it's just less handling of data. Now, the reason that you would use this over your primary key is going to be just based on if it's pure UI and you're only doing something within the UI for the duration of while the user is using the solution. This is absolutely perfectly fine to use. If you're going to implement a feature where that feature might be something that the user wanted to repeat or do over. In other words, what we just took a look at, where we were storing our key values and we wanted to bring up, say, the records of Tom and Susan specifically right here. And we want to allow the user to store this saved found set. And we're going to push this into a related table of stored standard queries or standard results. We absolutely have to use our primary key or our longer values. If we're just presenting the user with a pick list where they just check a couple of items and they want to load it, then using the FileMaker internal IDs is going to be a much better way to go. So in order to use this, all we have to do is go to our relationships, and in this particular case, what we're going to use instead is we're simply going to, rather than going to our ID from load, we are going to be going to the rec ID. And this now, just this one change, is a much lighter weight method of loading related records. Now, what we have to do is we have to actually get the right IDs, which, according to the way that I've created the records, so let's make a duplicate field right here. We'll put the rec ID on the layout. It probably is 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so it is right there. So just to show you that this actually happens, let me get rid of Tom. We will delete him. I forcibly deleted him holding down the Option key rather than just getting my prompt, which we see right there. That's Command or Control E in order to delete, and if you don't want to see this prompt, hold down the Option key. But what we can see, if I do a show all now, is we got rid of Tom. Now, in the rest of the life of this particular FileMaker file, there will never, ever be a rec ID number 2, ever again. It just won't happen. So we will put Tom on record number 5. So, as I said, this is a constantly incrementing value. So let's take Tom. He's 5. And then I think Susan was the other one. She was 4, and let's put 4 in there. So now what we have is we have much, much lighter weight data. Even if these numbers get up to, 46,564, this is still less data than our really long key values. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be able to use the same utility and load those two records. And you can see Susan and Tom get loaded right there based on much lighter weight data, and that's what we want to use. So the enhancement to this, if you use FileMaker's find mode, or you're writing a script and you go find some data, but you want to be able to pull that data back up again, you of course can run the exact same find again, which if that find, if new records get added or records get taken away, running the find again is going to give you the accurate results that you want. But if you want to retrieve and store a subset of records, regardless of whether new ones are added, and if old ones are deleted, then they just won't show up. What you can do is in your fields, you can create for free a summary field. And in FileMaker standards, I always prefix with summary and then the name of the aggregate function. In this case, it would be list of. And in this case, I would put rec ID, just like that. I switch my type to a summary type. And then we create that field right there. And then when that comes up, this one function right here, list of, allows us to get a list of anything that is indexed. Now, one of the easiest things is getting an index of our rec ID. So we say okay to that. And now, in order to retrieve all of the IDs of whatever the current found set is, we can use this particular function right here, or this particular aggregate. I'll show you the function that we can use. So right now, let's say I've gone in and I do a find for anybody that includes the letter A. Well, for some reason that doesn't work. Let's see. It's going to find Matt. Does it find ATT? It doesn't. I wonder if my indexing is messed up. Anyway, let's create a custom search. So let's say I'm finding Matt and I'm finding Susan. I've found those two records. I want to get all of their IDs without writing a record loop. That's going to come from that list of function. Let's show my data viewer, which happens to be off screen right now. I will bring that on screen, switch to my watch variable, get rid of those, and then we will create a new watch variable. And we are going to look at the get summary function. So the get summary simply takes two fields or two input fields. It's really pretty easy. We go to our summary, a list of rec ID. Now for the break field, we don't need to make this more confusing than it is. You just double click and add the exact same field. As you can see, because it's automatically evaluating, it's returning 1 and 4, which are my two records that are in my found set. If I go over here and I do a Command J or Control J to show all records, look at that jump from 1 and what was it, 1 and 4, or whatever it was. It is now 1, 3, 4, and 5. It gives me a list in my found set of all of the current rec IDs. I could push this to a related record, save it, do whatever I want. This is the utility of adding the rec ID and using the load global field in order to load whatever you want to load within your UI. All right, so let's cover the last two fields. These are basically just fields that I can talk about, and I'll tell you why I add them. They are JSON and unindexed. Now, these two we would just added just for the purpose of demonstration, but of course, you got the benefit of learning how to use the list of ID field. The unindexed field, as we can see, according to the comment down here at the bottom, it is just a template field. The only reason that I add this field into my default fields is as a reminder. I believe I've shot another video and it's freely available here on YouTube. If not, it's on the FileMaker Magazine website where you can always learn more about developing in FileMaker. This, every time that I see it, is simply a reminder that FileMaker, by default, treats every new field that you create, we'll look at the name field, in the storage area for every new field. This option right here by default means that the very first time that anybody does a search, does a get indexed, connects it within the relationship graph as a relationship, FileMaker automatically switches any field from this to either this or this. And if it's a large field that has a lot of text, that adds to the index, which adds to the size of the file, which may not be things that you want. So the unindexed field by default is not only set to none, but is also unchecked, and it forces me such that when I have when I'm creating a new field, rather than just going down here and adding my new field, which would be, I don't know, name last, and then clicking create, I do see it as a reminder, and as a developer, it's a habit now that I know that name last is more than likely going to be a searched field. But if it's a field that I'm not going to need to be searched, then what I'll do is I will simply select this, and I will click this. This forces me to have an unindexed field and then have to know, well, if I want this to be indexed, I now have to actually go in. It's so easy to change the type. You just change it right there. Click change. I now have to go in and forcibly tell FileMaker this field is going to be indexed. That is a much better way to develop a FileMaker solution if you want to be an advanced developer, because it forces you to make the decisions about what happens and when, rather than letting FileMaker do it, because FileMaker will be very kind and happily index everything. And that's when your solution is going to get big. That's when some things are going to slow down based on whether the user searches unindexed fields, what have you. You have to take full control if you want FileMaker to perform the best that it possibly can. So we will go ahead and cancel out of that, discard any of those changes, and head back in for the very last field, which is JSON. Now, when I select this one, JSON is just part and parcel of any advanced FileMaker solution. Now, there are many ways that you can use JSON in FileMaker. You can create a direct JSON representation of all of your fields. So my name, my last name, I can create a JSON structure that by default is calculated on the fly and could be an auto-enter value. Meaning I could have a field called JSON and it's set to auto-enter and it integrates various fields that I want from the current table, plus related data if you wanted to. I wouldn't advise on related data. Now, auto-enter is convenient, but it's not as flexible. If you simply just have a standardized field called JSON in all of your tables, what you can do is you can store a structured JSON format, but you can also store other information as well, because you can pull any given chunk of JSON out of a larger chunk of JSON. So if you have a representation of a certain number of fields that you want to represent a data object, well, if you store that within your JSON field, but you additionally give yourself the flexibility to also store maybe errors or other things that help with the utility of your FileMaker solution, that's a much better way to go, because you can always validate the JSON. So within this JSON field as a utility, I've found that many times it provides me with a degree of flexibility where I know that I can go to the one place where I know JSON is. It's in the JSON field, and I can always reference it because it's in every one of my tables. The rest of what's in the JSON field and how it's structured is just based on how I'm developing the FileMaker solution. So if I do have a representation of fields, then it's going to be identified by its particular key. And then the value itself is going to be an object. And then the rest of what's in that JSON can be for the utility of my UI within the FileMaker environment. And that's primarily how I actually use that JSON field, but it's standardized, and that's why it's one of the default fields, is because even if it sits here empty, if FileMaker is not transferring any data, it's of no consequence to me, but it's a standard that's available across all of my tables. So those are my fields that I use by default. Of course, you're going to always want all of your creation modification. It's helpful. These are super useful for UI and utility, in particular UI. Utility right here for free. Very advantageous in today's modern development world, and a reminder. And if you don't like the reminder, go ahead and don't include it. So how do you actually get these? What have we been staring at the whole time? It is this web page. This is the closing, and I'm going to walk you through where you get this file. Okay. So at the beginning of the video, I showed you where to store this file. If you need to know the path for Windows, you can look that up on Claris Search, or you can always go to, let's say, FileMakerSearch.com. That's a website that I created for myself, but it's public. FM Default Fields. And there we go. It comes up with a really good article written by Mark Baum over at Soliant, talking about where that is. He actually says where the default field is within the actual FileMaker Pro application. Of course, you need to modify this to FileMaker 19. Here is the path on Windows. So if you do need Windows, there's the path right there. Of course, it may be respective of FileMaker 20, or it may change. Just search for the documentation, just like I did on FileMaker Search or Google, either way. But if you want to start with the 12 fields that I use, you are going to find that at this URL right here, github.com, FileMaker Standards, FMP Standards. The location where it is within config folder. So we select on config. Within there, I've got EN for English. I do not have one for each of the different languages. If you want to do it for your own language, you will need to modify the index value, which we will take a look at. But the FM default fields only has what I would consider the fundamental. That's the primary key, the creation by and timestamp, modification by and timestamp, and then the UTC equivalents of those two. The extended is the one that has the found count, the all of the fields, the JSON, the unindexed, etc. So all you're going to do is you're going to put this into that shared location, and you're simply going to remove the underscore extended value. In fact, that's what we saw when we were in the Finder. You can see that I've got multiple. I've got core, I've got extended, I've got mat. So basically all I do is when FileMaker is shut down, then I simply just come in and I say what it is. Unused right there. So now FileMaker is going to use its own internal default fields, and if I wanted to use this mat one, I just simply just take that off. I've also created a FileMaker file that will swap it for you. I was doing that very frequently when I was working on a couple different client projects, and I needed a file that would quickly switch from one client's standards to another client's standards. But for when I'm doing most of my own development, I simply just come in here with FileMaker close. Actually, you can leave FileMaker running. And whatever FileMaker finds here in this folder, that's what will be used. You don't even need to shut FileMaker down. If I simply just take the value off of any one of those are the fields that will be created on the very next time that you create a new table. So if you want to learn how to add your own fields, here is how you do this. I'm going to switch over to the actual file itself. Now, this is an XML file. It's going to be a little bit confusing. There are these odd things right here. That will be in the Reliant article talking about this within this tag list, etc. The key thing is, and the problem that we found with, or that we had with the found count, this particular field. So this segment of code that we see right here on screen, which, sorry if the highlight isn't coming up, there is some setting in here that FileMaker either does not have, or I don't know about, or it doesn't apply, where we have to go in and check and uncheck that box that we learned at the earlier part of this video. Otherwise, if you have fields that you want to add to this, in particular, let's say there is a standard calculated field that you want to add, switching back to FileMaker, the best way to do this is simply to create the field that you want in FileMaker. So we will do my custom default field right here. Let's say that we do want that field to be a calculated field, and we are going to create that field. And the calculation is going to be some type of calculation. Let's say get UTC, let's say it's the microseconds, and for some reason you want it minus 8600. I don't know, for some reason, let's say an hour. So this is a calculation that FileMaker can replicate into default fields. Using a related field like this, where you are, let's say, using some different context. Actually, let's go from that to that, and you've got this right here. This will not work as a default field because the default field in a new table knows nothing about when you had created this particular field. So the best thing to do is to actually just stick to straightforward FileMaker calculations. Make sure your type is right. Make sure your storage is settings. This is the checkbox that I talked about earlier. I don't know if that's a setting that I can't find that isn't part of the default, because Claris doesn't provide the default specs. Long story short, once you have created the field, you can get this field's definitions by simply exporting this file's contents. So we'll say, okay, it is under Tools. You have to have turned that on in FileMaker's Preferences, and it is this option, Save a Copy as XML. As soon as I save a copy right here, I'm just going to save this right to my desktop and click Save. I'm going to replace that right now. I named that, just remember whatever the field is. I'm going to go over to Visual Studio Code. I am going to open a file. I'm going to open that XML file. It will have a super long list of all of the XML that represents the FileMaker file. I'm going to just search for the word custom, and there it is right there. You can see that it's got my custom default field. Now, all you have to do is you have to remember that you're going to take this whole field definition, you're going to copy this and take it and put it into the other thing, the FM default fields. You need to remember that this particular line, you can get rid of that. The chunk list can be taken away as well. You simply just need to reference that file and see what looks like it doesn't belong. For the most part, you're going to have an auto enter. If auto enter applies, if there's a calculation, it'll be within this particular tag. You'll have storage. If it's a calculated value, it'll have a calculation. Otherwise, it won't. Tag list, if you don't want it to appear by default on the layout, I think that's more or less what that is, then that's when you're going to have this particular tag. Make note that there is a space after what is highlighted right there, and that's just what you need to get right. And if you do that, then you'll have your own custom fields as a default. And simply just increment the ID value as you're adding your own fields if you want to, and then save it to a GitHub repo or do whatever you want with regards to having those default fields. And that's what we've got, and why I add those default fields to pretty much every table that I create in all of my FileMaker development. As always, I'd like to wish you much luck, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.